Today's episode is part one of a two-part special on the Matrix franchise. With the Matrix Resurrection coming out last December, we figured that a look back on the franchise was a good idea. We're going to discuss all five films and their video game tie-ins.
Looking back on the series today, I'm realizing what an undertaking we've taken on with this. I feel like Matrix does need a couple of episodes to look at everything, not necessarily because it's a lot of content. We're just talking three feature films, an animated anthology, and three video games that were released. And of course, the newest Matrix film where we'll see what happened after Matrix Revolutions. But I think what makes Matrix more of a challenge is a couple of things. One is how deep and complex it is as a concept and a series. There's quite a bit to unpack with the Matrix in terms of its layers of meaning and everything it references. It can also, at times, be extremely meta, which I guess comes with the territory given its influences, but we'll get into those soon enough. I had honestly forgotten a lot since I first watched the series, and it took rewatching the whole thing a couple of times to get a real sense of how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Oh, yeah, it goes pretty deep. With the Matrix being steeped with philosophical ideas, as well as blending together different religious ideas and beliefs with science fiction, gives the whole franchise a whole lot of layers to dig into. So much so that I've seen the movies like 10 or 12 times, and I still keep discovering new and deeper perceptions and ideas that I had not noticed before.
I'll be honest, the movies have that effect, and I had the same reaction the last couple times I watched it. The other aspect of the Matrix is that the tie-ins are so much more interconnected than you see in other series. With the Riddick series, for example, there's also an animated film and video game spin-offs that they did in roughly the same time frame as the Matrix. But I never felt like I had to watch all the tie-ins to get a sense of Riddick's overall story. They were just small adventures you could enjoy or ignore, and you never felt like you missed anything. But with the Matrix, there are important pieces of information that the tie-ins give you that show the breadth and depth of that universe. I really don't think you can get the complete picture of what the Matrix is without experiencing at least a certain amount of the tie-in materials, especially when looking at the Matrix sequels. So I think a longer discussion is important to getting to those points.
You were right about that, Steve. There are quite a few extra layers added to the movie, and a few much needed connections made in both the Animatrix and in the video games that are essential to knowing everything that is happening. And I'm not just talking about for those of us who are completists like me. This is need to know stuff, and that's why Steve and I are going to cover it here today.
Oh, definitely. The Matrix was a phenomenon in the 1990s, and if you were a kid at the time, the series was mind blowing. Not just in terms of the special effects or the costume designs or the martial arts, but also in the huge themes and ideas that it talked about. This movie dives into the nature of reality, the idea of control versus free will, and how our own cognition defines our own relationship with the world around us. Mike, do you want to talk a little about what the Matrix actually is?
Sure, Steve. Let me do that first by talking about the first film itself. Thomas A. Anderson is living two lives. In one life, he is a program writer for MetaCortex, a respectable software company circa 1999. He has a social security number, he pays his taxes, and he helps his landlady carry out her garbage. The other life is lived in computers, where he goes by the hacker alias Neo, and he is quite guilty of virtually every computer crime there is a law for. But here's the kicker: none of that is real. In fact, nothing Neo has ever experienced has been real. Why is that? He was born into a computer simulation called the Matrix, along with most of humanity, and that is designed to turn the human race into batteries for a race of AI. But there is a rebellion against the AI in the form of 250,000 humans that live outside the Matrix in the real world at a sanctuary hundreds of feet below the surface called Zion. What's more, they have a savior who is prophesied to put an end to this cyberpunk nightmare, our friend Mr. Anderson, aka Neo. But he'll have to let go of his perceptions of reality and embrace a world like a computer program. Rules can be embrace a world where, like a computer program, rules can be bent, some can be broken. A world without boundaries and controls. A world where anything is possible. Neo must believe in himself and who he is and embrace his destiny to become the one.
Yes, I think that pretty much sums the plot of the first film and Mr. Anderson up pretty well. The original Matrix struck the zeitgeist of the late 90s, dealing with conspiracy theories, questioning of the self and the system, cyberpunk, as you say, manipulation of reality, and just this super cool aesthetic. Leather jackets and sunglasses were everywhere at the time. It was also one of those films that opened the doors to superhero movies, even if it was dressed up in science fiction trappings. It also influenced the aesthetic of many superhero films of the early 2000s, including Blade and the X-Men. I honestly wonder to this day if the reason we have superhero films with darker visual elements is because of the influence this movie had. This movie really changed everything in terms of what action movies and superhero movies were and how people saw them. But of course, we have to talk about the architects of the Matrix, so to speak. The Matrix films were the brainchild of two directors, the Wachowskis. They are credited in these films as Larry and Andy Wachowski, or the Wachowski brothers. Now, they transitioned after making the Matrix films, taking the names of Lana and Lily, the Wachowski sisters. So if there's any confusion about the Wachowskis, keep in mind that it's the same creators with the same vision for the series.
Actually, they were not only writers and directors of the film, they were very hands-on in the making of the film. I mean, literally pulling the ropes that controlled the wires the actors were on. And speaking of writing the script, it's pretty impressive script. I mean, it was well thought out and detailed. They put out a really good comic book like storyboard. Even the minutia of the story was meticulously thought out by the Wachowskis. Also, I found this to be interesting. I read that some people have seen transgender themes in the film even before the Wachowski sisters came out as transgender women. The red pill offered by Morpheus has been compared with the red estrogen pills, and Morpheus's description of the Matrix giving you a sense that something is fundamentally wrong, like a splinter in your mind, has been compared to gender dysphoria. In 2020, Lily Wachowski flat out said that the Matrix was an allegory for transgender identity. If I'm being honest, I didn't pick up any of that when I watched the Matrix. I guess it just didn't occur to me, but I'm not the only one who missed that. Keanu Reeves said to Variety that he was unaware of the film being an allegory for transness during production. But if I'm looking for it, seeing it now, I can totally see it in there.
Oh, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I'll be honest. I wasn't really looking for the transgender interpretation either for the longest time. I don't think I even thought about it until I found out that the Wachowskis had transitioned. But that's certainly a valid take if you want to read that movie that way for sure. It's a movie about someone discovering the truth of who they are and then realizing the true potential that was hidden within themselves all along. The beauty of a concept like this is that you can apply it to your own experience, whatever that is, and it still works. It doesn't matter if you're trans, gay, neurodivergent, or anything else. We can relate to that journey of self-discovery and make it our own. It's an empowering and uplifting theme, no matter who you are. And I think that that's part of the reason why this film has endured for so long.
It takes a good writer, or writers in this case, to write about a specific experience in such a way that it can be embraced by all like that. I think that anybody who has taken the journey of self-discovery and come out the other side with the realities and perceptions expanded, making them a different and better version of themselves, can relate to the realization and eye-opening experience Neo went through on his journey of transformation. There are two facts that I have come to know. There is more to the universe than what we can perceive, and that we are all capable of so much more than we think we are. I think that same journey was undergone by Luke in Star Wars as he discovered the Force and his destiny, and look at the enduring quality of that film.
That's a good observation, Mike. The Matrix draws on the archetypal power of the hero's journey, much like Star Wars does. Both Neo and Luke are deliverer figures who become leading figures in their revolutions, and ultimately, they free their people from bondage, but they have to learn hard lessons in order to become the people they need to be to do that. The story of how this series came to be, though, is a pretty interesting one. The Matrix was surprisingly only the Wachowskis' second film, having made a neo-noir crime thriller called Bound. When the Wachowskis sold the script to an earlier film called Assassins, Warner Brothers bought two films from them as part of the deal, Bound and The Matrix. When Bound turned out to be a critical success, the Wachowskis leveraged it to direct The Matrix themselves. This turned out to be a huge win for WB, launching the series to iconic status with the first film.
And what a score it was, too. The Matrix trilogy ended up being one of the hottest film franchises of its day, right up there with Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. I mean, there must have been a billion people dressed like Morpheus, Neo, and Trinity for Halloween in 2003 and 2004. Not to mention the way the lingo and philosophical ideas about reality just became a part of everyday conversation. The Matrix was truly embraced, but I don't think the movie would have been as successful without its amazing cast.
Fishburne were already well known by the time this movie hit. Keanu had already been around for years, and Fishburne was a rising star at that time. But surprisingly, Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne, as iconic as they are now, were not the Wachowskis' first choices for Neo and Morpheus. They wanted to get Will Smith to play Neo, but he had agreed to do Wild Wild West and couldn't do it. I suspect he probably regrets that now because Wild Wild West wasn't that good or memorable beyond Smith's theme song for it. Val Kilmer was also on the table for Morpheus, but I think Fishburne had turned out to be a much better choice. Keanu grew into an actor by this point, and Fishburne is easily the standout performance in the movie for me.
What, dude? Will Smith is Neo and Val Kilmer, of all people, is Morpheus? Oh man, The Matrix would have been a way different movie with those two. I mean, I can't imagine anybody but Lawrence Fishburne as Morpheus. I've been a fan of his since Boys in the Hood and Event Horizon. He just has an intelligence and regalness about him that gives gravitas to his performance. Morpheus is by far my favorite of his roles. The same thing goes for Neo. Keanu Reeves, and only Keanu Reeves, is Neo. I loved Reeves in Point Break, and that was really the first action movie I had seen him in, and I thought he did quite well. But I was blown away by his action skills in The Matrix, even more so considering Keanu Reeves had undergone a 2-level fusion surgery in his neck due to some leg paralysis issues just before they started filming, just before they started training. That's actually why he doesn't do a whole lot of kicks in the first movie. The choreography alone, which was originally scheduled for 4 months, was stretched out to 6 months of long days, and to learn for Reeves to learn all that, all the training and all that, and he did all of that with a neck brace on and in severe pain. Even the shooting schedule for the film had to be worked around Reeves' healing process, but Keanu is a trooper when it comes to acting and a hardcore perfectionist. He wants his performance to not just be good, not even perfect. Reeve wants his performance to be, in his words, super perfect. He would often have the trainers come in on Sunday, their usual day off, to train with him so that each of his movements and gestures, especially as it pertains to martial arts, was spot on. Oftentimes, even when everybody thought they had a great take and were willing to move on, Keanu Reeves would request that they do another 2 more takes. I just can't help but be impressed by all of that.
Yeah, Keanu has an amazing work ethic. Now, a Smith Kilmer movie would have been vastly different for sure. Both of them are very good actors, but it wouldn't have been the movie we got. Would it have taken off as much without Keanu and Fishburne in the roles? I honestly don't know, but I doubt it. And I agree that Fishburne has this regal authority that he conveys. He's a Shakespearean actor, and he was the first black actor to play Othello in a feature film. I'll also add that he's an outstanding Othello in that film, too, if you're into Shakespeare like I am. Those qualities you mentioned is why he's so good in that movie. As for Keanu, I'm impressed by the level of commitment he makes to his films, and I think this is why he's only gotten better as he's matured as an actor. I'll be honest, I'm not that fond of some of the earlier films that I've seen him in. At the same time, Keanu's only improved as an actor since then, and his work ethic has especially made him a great action star. I can easily believe that Keanu probably took the same mindset to the John Wick series. It took Matrix to start him down that road, and I think it's fair to say this film made him an A-list action star he is today. Nowadays, I think Keanu ranks among the very best in terms of action film leads, and it's hard to see him any other way.
Oh, totally. He has come far enough in his career and his skills as an actor that he has completely rewritten people's perceptions of him. I mean, if you had told me after watching Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure that Reeves would be who he is today, I would have laughed in your face. But like Reeves himself went through some self-realization and just isn't that guy anymore. You want proof of that? Watch Bill and Ted's Face the Music. Keanu is just so far beyond that character now that it just wasn't Bill and Ted.
I haven't seen it, but I can believe it. It's hard to believe now, especially if you weren't there at the time, but Keanu wasn't always taken that seriously. I think it took films like Point Break to start to get him out of that image, and then Matrix pretty much was a turning point in his career.
Definitely, and I think that Matrix has to be up there as far as the amount of work Reeves has had to do for the film. Um, Before Keanu Reeves was even allowed to open up the script for The Matrix, the Wachowskis wanted him to understand all of the philosophical and perceptive layers that are woven into the film. Keanu and others had to read John Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation, which deals a lot with how things are perceived and over time even degraded. He also had to read Out of Control, which was about systems of control. And last but not least, Keanu had to read Introducing Evolutionary Psychology. I think the title pretty much speaks for itself on that one. But the idea is that the philosophies of the Matrix are a blend of both Eastern and Western schools of thought. In fact, before shooting began, they actually held a Buddhist ritual to bless the film.
Oh, that's amazing. Now, I will admit not to having read any of the books that you talked about, but I'd say that makes a lot of sense. There are a lot of influences that go into the deeper psychological and metatextual ideas within the Matrix, and it makes sense that Keanu would have familiarized himself with them going in. And yes, I think the original idea was definitely a bridging of Western and Eastern thinking. A lot of different world mythologies seep their way into the series at one point or another, though I think that comes across most strongly in the first film. Now, I will admit that it took a long time to appreciate all that depth, and for the longest time, I had never even seen the original film. I personally came into the Matrix a bit late myself. I had a bit of hyper version at the time, and I didn't see what the big deal was back then. Now, I eventually did see it, mainly because my brother was a huge fan of the film. This movie has grown on me quite a bit over time. I think it helps that the ideas are really deep and compelling, and they leave you thinking about what you've seen long after you've done watching the film.
It really does leave you thinking. I caught The Matrix in 1999 when a friend rented it and brought it over. Now I've heard people talk about their first experience watching A New Hope, how they were changed by the experience, like they could no longer see things the same way, and how seminal the film became. Well, I would put my first experience watching The Matrix that night in my apartment as an experience just like that. It's one of those ideas that you can't help but wonder, what if it's true? I mean, the simulation hypothesis is a scientific theory that people like Elon Musk and Neil deGrasse Tyson have said was better than a 50-50 possibility. The theory is that all of human existence, including Earth and the rest of the universe, could in fact be an artificial simulation, such as a computer simulation. That's right. You and everything you know could be a program, just a bunch of ones and zeros. The theory sounds crazy, but I think that as a science fiction guy, the idea is really fun to think about, and certainly comes into play when we're talking about the Matrix. So what do you think about that, Steve?
Well, the basic idea goes back to Rene Descartes. Even if the sci-fi spin was new at the time, it was a thought experiment where he realized that he couldn't trust any of the information from his senses. So he was looking for a rational foundation to the universe in a world of radical doubt about what was real. The conclusion that Descartes came to was that he could believe that he himself was real, even if he couldn't trust in the existence of anything outside himself, where you get, I think, therefore I am. The Matrix takes that idea, goes crazy with it, and dresses it up with cyberpunk and post-apocalyptic science fiction. The world we perceive is composed of what the electrical impulses in our brain tells us exists. And we basically take it on faith that what we perceive is real. Could that information we're receiving be artificial and we're just living in a tank feeding our robot overlord? Everything's possible, I guess, but I don't have a rational basis for that idea any more than I do for any other theory about what reality truly is. It is an idea that's fascinating to talk about, and it's a great idea to explore in a film or a comic, but who knows if there's any legitimate basis to it.
I think that what I like most about the theory is that you can't prove it's not true. Its likelihood is neither here nor there, really, especially as it pertains to playing with it in your imagination. But either way, there is no disputing that The Matrix became a seminal film. It was definitely one of a kind in its day, with heavy influence from anime and martial arts films. It was in some ways like a live-action anime with Chinese fight choreographers and wire fu techniques from Hong Kong action cinema. The Wachowskis' background isn't just in anime and martial arts, it's in comics. They even wrote a comic called Ecto Kid. In fact, it's in it is in appreciation for the impact that the still images of comics can have, that they try to take advantage of in that film, with the slow motion shots and their camera angles, or by another name, it's come to be known by bullet time, which allows the shot to progress in slow motion while the camera appears to move through the scene at normal speed. I remember being absolutely amazed by this effect. Even today, 22 years later, it's still one of the coolest effects I've ever seen. But that wasn't the only cool effect in that first film. That rippling glass on the skyscraper when they were rescuing Morpheus was crazy as hell. I guess that was actually even a practical effect to some extent, as they had to find a type of glass that would actually bend like that without shattering.
Oh, that's awesome. The comic book influence definitely comes through in The Matrix. I don't think that there's any argument that the Wachowskis are steeped in it. In fact, two well-known names in comics worked on The Matrix. One is Jeff Darrow, who worked with Frank Miller on The Big Guy and Rusty the Boy Robot. He was conceptual designer on all the Matrix films. Beyond that, there's also Steve Scroce, who was a huge name in comics in the 90s, having done runs on Spider-Man, Gambit, and Wolverine. He even did a short run with Alan Moore when they reinvented Rod Liefeld's Youngblood very briefly. I'll also add that Wolverine Blood Debt, which was written and drawn by Scroce, is actually a really great Logan story and well worth checking out. Scroce worked with the Wachowskis on Ecto Kid, and that led him to becoming the storyboard artist on the Matrix films. I think the Wachowskis knew their comics quite well even back then, and they brought the best people they could find who could achieve a comic-inspired look to the film. I don't think there's much question that the Wachowskis got what they were looking for. The Matrix was a relentlessly cool film, and it pushed the boundaries of what could be done in film. So it won 4 Academy Awards, in fact: Best Film Editing, Best Sound Editing, and Best Visual Effects. All of their effects were groundbreaking, and they still hold up pretty well today and how well to make an action film. Bullet Time opened the door to a lot of effects in modern superhero films. Also, since you brought up Wire Fu, that movie also had Yuan Wu Ping, the best action choreographer in the business. Wu Ping had worked on stunt choreography with Hong Kong action stars like Jackie Chan, Donnie Yen, Jet Li, and Michelle Yeoh. But it was a film called Fists of Legend that got the Wachowskis to notice Wu Ping, and they brought him in to do The Matrix. I can't imagine this movie without his stunt work, especially Neo's training bout with Morpheus. And Wu Ping only did even more impressive things after that. He's probably best known for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and Kill Bill Volumes 1 and 2. The Matrix would not have looked as awesome as it is without Wu Ping and his outstanding stunt choreography.
Yeah, that's quite an impressive list of people that he's worked with, all of which have done some pretty amazing stunts and choreography in their films. And his work on The Matrix is definitely one of his crown jewels.
Absolutely. There were many influential people involved in The Matrix, as you say, but there's one person I wish had gotten more credit. One interesting fact about this film is that it borrowed heavily from Grant Morrison's comic called The Invisibles. There are shot-for-shot similarities between The Invisibles and what was shown in The Matrix, and if you search it online, you'll find it. The costume designs are very Morrison-inspired. Morpheus looks a lot like King Mob from The Invisibles, and some of the Nebuchadnezzar crew look like The Invisibles in their Matrix costumes. The torture of Morpheus echoes a similar scene featuring Morrison's King Mob. The similarities are so convincing that Warren Ellis actually dedicated a Matrix-themed episode of Planetary to Grant Morrison. Now, the themes and ideas are also quite similar. Both series focus on the idea that reality is a lie and that the heroes are a group of revolutionaries against those who secretly control the system. Both deal with the nature of reality, with a messiah figure as the central character. Jack Frost and Neo have a bit in common in that sense. The agents also correspond to the conspiracy of alien gods and the Invisibles. The cool and stylish aesthetic of The Matrix, I think, owes a lot to Morrison, really.
Wow. I have not heard of The Invisibles before, but I'll be damned if I'm not going to search it out now. That's definitely on my to-be-read list. I love some Grant Morrison.
Morrison is definitely one of the best to steal from. In fairness, though, I think the Wachowskis made The Matrix sufficiently different from The Invisibles that I don't think it's a complete ripoff, even if they borrowed from it heavily. Matrix is much more science fiction oriented than Morrison's magic and mythology approach, and the two worlds operate very differently. Also, I'd say Trinity is a different character from her basis, even though I think the initial idea may have been lifted from Ragged Robin. The Wachowskis also brought other influences to the Matrix, including anime and Hong Kong action flicks. The two series may have started with similar ideas, but they branched off into very different directions. Now, I wish Morrison had been properly credited and compensated, given the huge success of the film, but hey, that's the way it goes in Hollywood.
I'm going to have to read The Invisibles myself before I can really comment on that, but that is an interesting bit about the Wachowskis' influence with the story. That definitely sounds like there are some similarities. But let's transition into the next film, The Animatrix. I'm not a big fan of anime, but this movie was not bad. I definitely think one should watch the film if they're going to get the whole Matrix story and understand the references made in Reloaded and Revolutions. But I don't think that all of the episodes are necessary, really. The biggest two I think everyone needs to see is the Second Renaissance. It's a two-parter, which has to be the best of the shorts, as it explains the whole Rise of the Machines event. I liked it a lot. B166ER, the servant robot who simply did not wish to die, I believe is a callback to Sonny from iRobot, who had a similar feeling about not wanting to be terminated. I bet the humans in Second Renaissance wish they had installed Isaac Asimov's three laws, though, which, for those of you who are unaware, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given to it by a human being, except where such orders would conflict with the first law.
Oh, you gotta love Asimov's influence on robotics. But before I go on, I just want to say that B166ER is an interesting name. There was another influence that I think that it had. I don't think I realized until just recently that it spells out bigger. I suspect that this may be a reference to Bigger Thomas from Richard Wright's novel Native Son. That character was also a victim of racial discrimination who ends up becoming a murderer. If that's an intentional reference, and I suspect it may have been, that was really cleverly done. Now, I may be more of an anime fan than you are, but I have to admit that I'm not that deep into anime either. I'm what's called an old taku. I lean more towards the older anime because that's when I got into it. I come from the days of Akira, Ninja Scroll, and Cowboy Bebop. So Animatrix hits a lot of those notes for me. It's in many ways that kind of anime, though the shorts all hit very different anime styles. But let's focus on the first piece. I think that Second Renaissance is honestly required viewing when it comes to the Matrix, and I wish we'd seen it referenced more directly in the Matrix sequels. And I say that because in many ways this short completely throws the narrative we've heard from the original film on its head and casts it in a very different light. I think the history of the Matrix shown in these two shorts is a brilliant setup, if I'm honest. I could see an AI rebellion starting in exactly this way. But I think what's really important here is that humans aren't innocent victims in their war against the machines. The machines turn on humanity because their creators treat them horribly. And then when the machines stand up for their rights as sentient beings, the humans decide just to destroy them. The humans are driven by fear and hatred of their creations. Is it any wonder that the machines want to keep humans under control? To them, this is an act of self-preservation so that the humans don't rise up and destroy them again. It might even be that from the machines' point of view, they think they're being merciful. They don't kill the humans and they let the humans live comfortably in a fantasy world rather than let them realize what's being done to them. So the machines do some really bad things themselves, as the narrator points out, but it's the humans that really push the robots to the brink of war at every turn.
That is a very good point. Each side seems to paint the other as the villains. But if I'm being honest, I tend to believe the machines over the humans. For thousands of years, humans have gone out conquering and to conquer, only to play the victim card when our victims, we call enemies, fight back. And that sounds exactly like what the humans did to the machines. I find it interesting that in the Second Renaissance, they say that the machines had the pure spirit of humans, i.e., the good and peaceful spirit of what man could be, and the light of that spirit generates in dark places.
That is interesting. If AI were built in the image of their creators, it stands to reason that they would have the same spark that we have on some level. At the same time, they are built on a flawed image by flawed creators, and on some level, the machines are the children of humanity. The narrator talks about the sins of humans and machines. The machines are the best and the worst of us in some respects. Also, in retrospect, I think Second Renaissance may have influenced a video game called Detroit Become Human, which also deals with robots becoming sentient and campaigning for human rights and fair treatment only to face discrimination. If you want to know what the early days of the Second Renaissance might have been like, I would suggest playing that game. It's a really good handling of the questions of AI, discrimination and dehumanization, and passive resistance versus open conflict. Also, Clancy Brown plays a burned out cop in it, and his relationship with his robot partner Connor, who you play as, is well worth the admission price. There is so much about these ideas that's worth exploring, and Second Renaissance only scratches the surface of it. Now, if I have any regrets about this segment, it's that I wish this material was actually addressed in the Matrix sequels, especially Matrix Revolutions, because I think any piece between humans and the machines has to address the machine's point of view. And we only get to understand them when we understand why they rose up in the first place. I feel like the films all too often focus so much on playing the agents and the machines as the monsters of the movie that the point of view gets lost in that shuffle. But this was a really amazing two-part short film that is unmissable in my view.
Oh, I am in 100% agreement. You don't understand the story of the Matrix without those two shorts. Another connection they made to the Matrix story was in the kid story, which is the backstory on the kid who keeps following around Neo, talking about how Neo saved him, but Neo keeps saying that he saved himself. He turns out to be the first self-actualized person, someone who got themselves out of the Matrix by jumping off the roof of the school building to his death. The story is not super cool or anything, but it is interesting and does put a needed piece into the puzzle.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Popper in the Matrix sequels was not my favorite character, if I'm honest. He annoyed me a little bit at times in those films before I saw Animatrix. That said, I think he's much better in Kid Story. He's an ordinary kid, and by the end, you understand why he looks up to Neo as much as he does. I think you really need to see Kid Story to put this character arc in perspective, too. The films try to allude to it, but the full context is important to understanding who Michael Popper is.
Definitely. Last but not least, in the absolutely have to watch category, is Final Flight of the Osiris, which ties directly into the Matrix Reloaded and the Enter the Matrix video game, as they are the ones who discover that the machines are drilling down to Zion, and they are the ones who get the message to the ship captains. The reason they all are having the meeting there at the beginning. This was my favorite episode after the Second Renaissance.
I really liked Final Flight of the Osiris as well. I didn't know how everything fully connected for the longest time. And without context, there's a lot that doesn't really add up until you see the strings. But as you say, it's a crucial piece of the puzzle. I believe they did show this one in the theaters before Matrix Reloaded came out, though I don't remember too well now. One point worth noting is that the animation in this piece was done by Square USA, which most people today would know as Square Enix. This is the company that's best known for creating the Final Fantasy games. Even back then, though, they were making huge strides in CGI animation, and their animations are often among the best in the games industry. Final Flight of the Osiris definitely looks like a Square piece, and I think they got the look of the Matrix universe down really well. The continuity connection in this piece with the second film and Enter the Matrix game is a big issue, though. I don't want to get too much into Enter the Matrix just yet, as it centers on Captain Niobe and her crew, and I feel like Niobe is someone we need to discuss in more depth when we talk about Enter the Matrix and the Matrix sequels.
Definitely. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But one episode that is not necessary, but is a whole lot of fun, is a detective story. I couldn't help but think of the name of that bar Sarah Connor tries to hide out in the Terminator, called Tech Noir. That is the perfect description of the story. A noir-type detective tries to track down Trinity and learn the truth, but he does, but he dies in the process.
Oh, yes, that was very much what they were going for. Cyberpunk and noir go together extremely well for some reason. Blade Runner being perhaps the best known example. Using Trinity for this story also works because every good noir story involves a mysterious game of some kind, and Trinity is very good in the role too. We know who she is, but Ash doesn't, and we know he's not going to like what he finds. Tragedy is also something that fits extremely well with noir, and I think that piece ends on just the right note. But I don't want to diminish the other pieces in the Animatrix because they're not as tied up in the big picture storyline that the Wachowskis have set up for the series. Some of the others, like Program, are small character pieces, whereas others explore the world building of the Matrix in ways that we just can't see with Neo, Morpheus, and Trinity directly involved. Also, some of them are worth noting for their visual styles, too. Program looks pretty strongly influenced by Yoshitaka Amano's art style. Amano did a lot of art for Final Fantasy, but he's also worked in comics, including Sandman, the Dream Hunters with Neil Gaiman. The Matrix sequences with Sis and Duo dressed up as samurai in feudal Japan especially had that Amano look to me. With Square involved in Final Flight and Wachowski's being involved with the comics world and anime, I'm going to guess that that was an intentional style choice. Now, World Record and Beyond interested me on my second viewings of them. I think they're noteworthy because it's our only glimpse into how the agents and the machines deal with humans who come close to figuring out the truth. The Oracle talks in the second film about the strange phenomena like ghosts and UFOs and vampires being glitches in the Matrix, and we see one instance of this and Beyond. It seems like there are places within the Matrix where the code of the universe is glitched. This allows for exploits that let humans use enhanced abilities without any kind of training like Neo got. And we see what happens. The agents find these places and debug them in the guise of exterminators. Beyond itself is not that great of a piece, but the concept is really interesting and I quite like the art on it. In the case of World Record, it's much worse. A gifted runner finds out that when he runs, he can actually break through the Matrix and see the truth behind it. So the agents catch him, reprogram him, and prevent him from walking again so he can't do that again. It's a sad story, but I think it sheds light on what happens to those who get too close to the truth. The minute a human comes close to breaking the conditioning, he becomes a threat to the system and has to be eliminated. I actually wasn't so crazy about the stylized art in this one, but I thought the writing was really solid for a smaller story like this.
You were right about those really filling out the world better. And I personally think that people should watch them to get the complete picture. As you said, Steve, there are definitely things to be picked up from all the shorts in the Animatrix. But let's get into the video game Enter the Matrix.
Okay.
Reloaded brings together the other tie-ins like the Animatrix and Enter the Matrix video game that expands the story between Animatrix and Reloaded. The Wachowskis actually made the video game an integral part of the story. We find out some key bits of information about the characters, and some of the gaps left by the films are all filled in. We've talked a bit about the Animatrix and Reloaded already. So I'd like to talk specifically about the story portion of the Enter the Matrix video game right now, as its tie-ins to the Animatrix, Reloaded, and even Resurrection with the Sati character. We'll talk about the 23 scenes as I've seen them in the extras of the Ultimate Matrix collection, but there are gameplay gaps between those scenes, and Steve is going to help us out with that portion of the story. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us a bit about the game in general, Steve?
Sure, Mike, I'd be glad to. I'll be honest, going through this game completely changed my view of the Matrix Reloaded after seeing the playthrough for the first time. I originally thought that Enter the Matrix was just some side content that you could take or leave, much like you see with other video game tie-ins to film franchises. That is not the case here. Enter the Matrix starts off following Final Flight of the Osiris, and then it becomes a full-on sidequel to the Matrix Reloaded. By that, I mean that the game follows Captain Niobe and the crew of the Logos and what they were doing during the events of Reloaded. You can play either as Captain Niobe or as Ghost, her second command aboard the Logos. The game then follows one of these two perspectives, with events being slightly different depending on who you're playing as. Both viewpoints are worth playing because we see glimpses of who Niobe and Ghost are and their connections to the main characters in the films. Although Niobe is a major player in the sequels, Ghost actually is a pretty awesome character in this game, and I wish we'd seen more of him in the movies. With Reloaded and Enter the Matrix, the Wachowskis were doing something that was unheard of at the time, and it's still not that common today. They tried to create a unified story between the story of the games that adds up to a larger narrative with the films. The Wachowskis were heavily involved in the making of the game, especially on a story level. In fact, they filmed an hour of extra content for Enter the Matrix at the same time that they made Reloaded and Revolutions. And that is the extra film content that we're talking about before this. That extra content filmed for the game connects a lot of the dots that don't quite make sense if you just see Reloaded on its own. It also explains why Reloaded does some of the things it does and why it feels at times like a video game, because it is in part a video game. I used to have serious problems with Reloaded, but I think it was because there were things that I hadn't seen. In light of what I've seen in Enter the Matrix, I think my problems are mainly in the way the film explains things rather than what the film is now. We'll talk about that more in part 2 when we get to Reloaded itself. Enter the Matrix was a game that was made for the PlayStation 2, and the graphics and gameplay are very much of that time. The character models are still a bit blocky, and the main gameplay is a bit reminiscent of something like the very early Grand Theft Auto games. It's a third-person action game that tries to be cinematic in its approach, but the technology wasn't yet there to completely pull that off. Still, for its time, it's a very ambitious game, and I think the movie paved the way for more cinematic action games that we see now. The action is consistent with the films. You can use bullet time, you can wall run, all the other tricks, in addition to martial arts and weapons. This may have been one of the first games to use parkour mechanics, which are common in action games now. There are also a couple of driving levels, and at the very end, you get a rail shooter in the logos as the ship tries to evade the machines in the real world. The extra film content is woven throughout the game, and the way it's done works. The real world scenes are most of the cinematic scenes, and the playable scenes are in the Matrix for the most part. All in all, it's a pretty solid game for its day, but it hasn't aged that well. I think it's the kind of game that could use a modern remaster treatment or even a remake now. Like the original Matrix film, Enter the Matrix was a game that was well ahead of its time.
Right, all right. Let's get into the story of the game there. Right off the bat, there's a connection to the Animatrix episode Final Flight of the Osiris, with Niobe and the Logos getting the last transmission of the Osiris from the broadcast drop. Niobe and Ghost return with it and transmit the message to Zion, where Captain Deadbolt Locke, the only place we hear him called that, sees the transmission. After seeing the transmission, Commander Locke contacts the Logos and orders Captain Niobe to recall all of the ships to Zion to prepare for the coming onslaught. The captains all meet at the same place we saw them having the secret meeting in Reloaded, implying that this was a usual meeting spot for them. Captain Niobe tells the other captains about the machine army as Morpheus and the Neb crew arrive. But the meeting is disrupted by the guards from upstairs coming down and announcing the arrival of the feds. After Neo warns them the agents are coming and they should retreat to their exits, and everybody does. But while they are at the meeting, Captain Soren thanks Captain Niobe for saving their man and says that he's grateful to be alive. But there was some gameplay in the midst of all that, and just afterwards. And this is where you jump in, Steve. What portions of the story were what portions of the story were in the gameplay narrative?
Oh, all of it and a lot more. We see what Niobe and Ghost were doing during the events of the entire second film. But we'll get into all that as we discuss each scene, in the cut content. The early parts of the game are actually set before Reloaded, and those early levels set up the meeting of the captains that we see at the start of Reloaded. The first mission deals with Niobe and Ghost breaking into a post office to get the Osiris's data drop and then sending the information back to Zion. After you complete the mission, Commander Locke then places Niobe in charge of recalling all the ships back to Zion for the defense. The game follows that up by sending the Logos crew to rescue Captain Soren and his men during a big fight at an airport within the Matrix. That sets up an offhand line from Soren the later, the one you talked about, but I get ahead of myself. Why don't we talk about what happens after they escape from the airport?
Sure. The next scene, which I think is for playing the Niobe character, shows Niobe and Ghost at the same subway that we saw Neo fought Agent Smith in the original film. But they're carrying an injured man named Axel that they seem to have rescued. While he is thankful, Niobe tells him that he would have done the same thing. However, he might not feel so thankful tomorrow. But either way, Niobe tells Axel that he needs to tell Captain Soren to meet them at midnight, and Axel picks up the phone and leaves the Matrix. Right after Ghost leaves, Niobe is confronted by the train man, who tells her that Zion only lasted 72 hours last time, but Niobe doesn't get it. What does he mean last time? I can't help but wonder if Axel was the person Captain Soren thanked Niobe for saving in that last sequence. There's clearly a large gap between the last story and scene in this one. Why don't you fill us in here, Steve?
Yeah, I think you're reading it largely right. Axel is a member of Soren's crew, and you save him after the big airport fight in the early levels of the game. Niobe is ordered to set up the recall for all the ships to return to Zion, so she goes in to save Soren's crew. This is also part of a huge setup for the captain's meeting that we see at the start of Reloaded. This is why Soren thanks Niobe in that scene. You're right about that. He's directly referencing Niobe and Ghost coming to Soren's rescue at the airport. And yes, Axel is involved in that. It looks like an offhand line in the film, but it takes on real meaning if you know what happens in the game. Now, the Train Man scene is shown in Enter the Matrix, but it's never expounded on in any of the gameplay. I think the implication is that this is a pattern that has happened before in the past. Some humans free themselves, probably with the help of the One. They found a human city, and then they're wiped out by the machines. Agent Smith also alluded to this to the Reloaded as well, though again in vague terms, and we see even more of this when Neo meets the Architect. I think the Train Man is saying that a previous version of Zion was wiped out in 72 hours by the machine. Or maybe the Train Man is just messing with Niobe to try to scare her, whichever you prefer. But the game follows that up by taking the player to the meeting itself. We get some of the footage from the beginning of Reloaded that set up the meeting. And then from there, we see the Logos crew's viewpoint of what happened at the meeting. As Niobe or Ghost, you have to get out when the agents attack the meeting site. Neo distracts the agents, so you're mostly just fighting SWAT team members that are working for them. You also have to rescue some of the other rebels that were at the meeting before the agents catch up to them. It's at that point that they run into the Keymaker from the second film, who has the keys to all the back doors in the Matrix. Mike, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. The next scene shows Niobe and Ghost escaping with the Keymaker into a programmer's maintenance passage, where we see Neo, Smith, and Seraph later in the films. The Keymaker says that the Matrix is structured like a building, built on a foundation and substructure, implying that this is where said programmer's maintenance passage exists. The Keymaker shows Niobe and Ghost the key that can only be used once, that is an integral part of the path of the One, and that it unlocks the future. It is, of course, the key that Neo will need in Revolutions. Just then, two of the Merovingian's henchmen show up and steal the key right out of the Keymaker's hand and take off, but not before commenting that the scared expression on the Keymaker's face showed that he was reacting just like a human, and revealing that they had left the door unlocked on purpose, though they don't show what this means in the scene. Can you shed some light on this, Steve?
I'll admit that I had not seen this scene until I went through the gameplay, and it fills some serious gaps. This happens after the agents bust up the big captain's meeting. As Ghost or Niobe, you manage to get out and save some of the other crews as well. The Keymaker finds you at the end of that and gets you out of there through one of the back doors in the Matrix. You then have to go into the Merovingian's chateau and try to find the key, but it's too late. The goons gave the key to the Merovingian, and you can't get it back from him. The most you can do is rescue your partner, Ghost or Niobe, whoever you're not playing as, and get out of there. One of the nagging things about Reloaded as a standalone film is that I never understood how the key just conveniently ends up gone. This also gave me a feeling like Neo saving the Keymaker was a pointless exercise because it didn't seem to lead anywhere. That question is answered with the Keymaker scene, which sets everything up properly. The Keymaker tried to give Niobe the key, but that plan is interrupted by the Merovingian's goons, with everyone else having to pick up the pieces later. You really need the scene to make any sense of what's going on in Reloaded, I think.
The scene does add more gravity to Neo rescuing the Keymaker, and that makes it pretty key. No pun intended. The next scene shows the characters coming into a room and interacting with Persephone individually. So it has two versions, one for each character. Persephone starts off the dialogue by implying that Niobe and Ghost were separated and are now looking for each other. But before we get into the scene, I have to comment on the name Persephone, as I think that the Wachowskis are painting a picture by giving her that name. In Greek myth, Persephone was the daughter of the goddess Demeter, who was raped by Hades with Zeus's consent. Hades then abducted her while she was picking flowers and took her to the underworld against her will. While Persephone's mother Demeter worked out an arrangement with Hades to let her out every 6 months, Persephone remained the wife of Hades. I can't help but think that a dark past like this is the nature of the relationship between Persephone and the Merovingian, who would be Hades in this case. Persephone does not appear to be with the Merovingian because she wants to be in the films. Also, in the Greek myths, Persephone is often persuaded to make exceptions for people in the underworld, like allowing allowing those who went there after death or who were even imprisoned there by Zeus to leave or even come back from the dead, retain their reasoning ability, or many other things. But the point is that the Matrix character Persephone seems to be willing to use her position to help others against the will of her husband too. I am all but certain that these parallels are intentional.
Oh, yes, absolutely spot on. I had very much the same thought as you did there. Persephone is a prisoner of the underworld, the criminal underworld in the case of the Merovingian's wife. I think the reason she is drawn to experience the love of others is because she can't have it herself. She exists in a loveless marriage that she can't escape, probably because that's what she's programmed to be. Like Persephone, the mythical version, she helps others escape the underworld, similar to what the mythic Persephone did for Orpheus. And yes, Niobe and Ghost are separated at this point. During one of the earlier levels in the chateau, the Merovingians' men capture and try to torture whoever you're not playing as. So as Ghost, you have to rescue Niobe, and as Niobe, you have to rescue Ghost. There are two versions of the Persephone scene, and which one you get depends on the path you've chosen to play as. Persephone helps you get to where you need to go to save your partner in the game, giving you safe passage from the other world.
All right. Keep that parallel between the Persephone characters in mind as I go over what happens in this scene. In both versions of the scene, Persephone reminds the character that she can fill the room they are in with her husband's men at any moment, and the character responds by asking her what she wants. Persephone says that she didn't used to know what that question even meant, but now it's all she can think about. She goes on to say that while she does enjoy the taste of tears, there is something that she loves even more, and that both Niobe and Ghost have it in them. And that thing is that they are in love with someone. She can see it like a heat burning in their chest, like she does later with Neo. Persephone asks for a kiss from each of them as if they were kissing the person they were in love with. But it is clearly more than a kiss to Persephone, as she's able to read things about their love from the kiss. She's able to tell Niobe that she's not in love with Jason, Commander Locke, as she claims to be, but that she is sure Jason knows that truth. This is clearly a reference to Niobe's relationship with Morpheus, although it is not directly stated. However, we see the fruits of this revelation later in Niobe's interactions with both Locke and Morpheus. With the Ghost character, after Persephone gets her kiss, she says that the love in Ghost is unrequited, and implies that this love is for Niobe. In both cases, Persephone lets them go, but with Ghost, she says that after that kiss like that, she won't even tell her husband that Ghost is coming, which definitely has the feel of the Greek Persephone. Plus, I would like to add that the scene ends with Persephone opening up the secret passageway behind the shelf of books, just like in Reloaded, leading me to believe that the previous scene with the Keymaker might have preceded this one.
Yes, the Keymaker scene does precede that one. The Keymaker scene is what leads Ghost and Niobe to deal with the Merovingian. As for the rest, I think that's mostly a good reading of that scene, though I do want to mention a couple of things. I think this scene is probably the first deep character scene that we get in Enter the Matrix. Mostly up to this point, it's just connecting plot points running alongside Reloaded. But here we actually see a glimpse into who Niobe and Ghost are as people, and we don't really get that until we hit this scene. You're correct on Niobe. I think she may have loved Locke at one point, but by this scene, it's gone. Her deeper love is for Morpheus. I don't think that there's really any doubt that she still loves Morpheus and probably always did. I think Niobe is someone who wants to believe, but can't believe in the way Morpheus does. So Locke calls to the rational side of her, while Morpheus represents the part of her that represents faith. And she's been leaning more towards faith and less towards Locke's points of view lately. Now, the Ghost scene, I think, is the most interesting. Now, like you, I originally thought that Ghost was in love with Niobe, but we learn later that that's not the case. That might be for the best, as we already have a love triangle with Morpheus, Niobe, and Locke already. But I think this is where Ghost really starts becoming fascinating for me. He's philosophical, but he can be ruthless too. He's driven by a tragic love he can never have, doing what he does because it's right, not because it benefits him. I wish we got more scenes like this because Ghost is an interesting character in the few deeper scenes he gets.
Right. Yeah. Definitely. That definitely adds a lot more depth to that scene and makes the characters a lot cooler. The next scene shows the Logos finally returning to Zion after meeting with the captains, where Morpheus asks for one ship to stay behind until they hear from the Oracle, in defiance of Captain Locke's recall order. Ghost notes that the Neb isn't back yet and wonders how Commander Locke is going to feel about that. Niobe says that she doesn't know, but that she's going to stay as far away from that as possible. The next scene, which must have happened very soon after the one I just mentioned, because it shows Niobe just getting to her room after arriving at Zion. She barely closes the door before Commander Locke is knocking on it, wanting to talk to her about her involvement in the insubordinate act of the Caduceus ship staying behind, despite his orders that they all needed to return. But right away, it seems pretty clear that what he wants to talk about is Morpheus and why he does what he does. Niobe explains that anybody who saw the transmission from the Osiris would be all but certain that mankind was going to be wiped out. Everybody that is except Morpheus. Morpheus not only believes that they can win, he inspires that belief in others, and that's why Commander Locke needs Morpheus. There's a small kiss between Locke and Niobe that obviously bothered Niobe after hearing what Persephone told her and about who she truly loves. Locke notices, but Niobe claims that she's just tired, and they agree to meet up later.
Good call on that last bit. I do think that Persephone shook Niobe on some level, but this is another section of the game that helps shed light on things. I think this scene helps a little because it's important to see Locke from Niobe's perspective. I found Locke to be a very difficult to like in the films. He's rigid and flexible a lot of the time, a bit too hard-edged in most of the scenes he's in. But with Niobe, we get to see him with his defenses down more, and I think it helps give us a more complete picture of who Jason Locke is as a person. We also get more of a sense of why Niobe and Locke were together at this point in time. But deep down, Niobe still respects and even admires Morpheus, even if she doesn't share his unwavering faith in the One. This threatens Jason, and I think it drives him in making mistakes that break their relationship, as we see later.
Very true. The next two scenes are actually pretty mysterious, and Steve, you're going to have to explain them because I don't get it. We see Trinity come into a room with a bed that has two places on it. Ghost is on the left, and Trinity lays down next to him on the right. Behind the bed is what I think is a computer and a bunch of wires. They wake up as if they had just come out of the Matrix, but they don't appear to have ever been plugged in. I mean, nobody unattaches that thing that goes into the back of their head or whatever. Based on their conversation, I would say that Ghost and Trinity were having, I don't know, a counseling session perhaps? Like I said, Steve, I can't make any sense of this.
Was it a counseling session? Kind of. What happens is that after Trinity leaves Neo, she meets up with Ghost. They plug in and have a sparring session in the Matrix, and you actually fight Trinity as Ghost. You defeat her, and then they work out their issues through their sparring. We also find out that they call each other brother and sister. It may not have been literal, though, even though it's pretty obvious they're not biologically related. I think the scene implies that Ghost and Trinity grew up together. It's possible that one or both of them were adopted, but it's never spelled out and it's never fully explained. Either way, they're very close and have been for a long time. Given the nature of Zion, I'd say childhood friends is how I would probably read their relationship without anything more definitive to go on. It's at this point that I started realizing that Ghost's unrequited love was for Trinity, not Niobe. This becomes noticeable, especially when Trinity asks about getting Ghost a girlfriend, and he starts talking about celibacy. Clearly a deflection. He can never be more than he is with Trinity, but he's made peace with that even if he can't fully move on from her. The other interesting angle to Ghost here is that he's a true believer in the One. I think this is another reason that he would never try to interfere with Trinity's relationship with Neo. Ghost seems to really respect him. So he's a real believer in the cause, and he's on Morpheus' side for faith-based reasons. These layers make Ghost really compelling in the rare quieter moments he gets in this game.
That actually does make a lot of sense with the gaps filled in. Also, I think that you're definitely right about Ghost being in love with Niobe. It's just one too many roosters in the hen house. And honestly, I like Ghost a lot more after hearing your description of him there. Besides, I like a good philosopher. Mm-hmm. Scene 12 is basically a montage scene. of when Captain Ballard meets Seraph to get the message from the Oracle. We also see Bane from the Caduceus crew encountering Smith, and Smith takes over Bane's body. But there's also a couple of interesting tidbits revealed in the other scenes of the montage, like Seraph reporting to the Oracle for service because he is forever indebted to her, and a scene between Niobe and Locke that reveals that Locke convinced the Council to hold back Niobe's ship, the Logos, saying that it was too small and its EMP would be too weak to have much effect, which wasn't true, and pisses Niobe off, as she is a captain just like all the other captains. But Locke says no, she is the woman that he loves. This adds an extra sting for Locke when Niobe defiantly answers the Council's call to go out later and explains the dirty look that he gives her for volunteering.
Now, here we begin to understand why Locke and Niobe's relationship is strained. Locke used his influence as commander to keep Niobe away from the battle, wanting to protect her, and Niobe strongly disagreed with his decision. These scenes also help to explain why Niobe decides to volunteer her ship to search for Morpheus later on. She doesn't believe in the One, but she believes in Morpheus, and the fact that he believes is important to her. It's understandable why Locke does what he does, but I can also understand why it would push them apart too. If you include the game content, the romance arc for Niobe and Morpheus suddenly makes a lot more sense. I think Locke's decision here, while well intended on his part, is what finally breaks the relationship, even if neither of them have fully realized it yet.
As a side note, real quick, one thing I noticed while rewatching the films recently is that Captain Niobe has a perma-pissed look on her face throughout the whole movie. I mean, hard as a rock and daggers for eyes, except that is when she's looking at Morpheus. That is the only time you see her smile, but back to the gameplay.
That makes perfect sense now, yes. She's perma-pissed because of her issues with Jason, I suspect. Anyway, back to the game. The following levels correspond more or less to what we see reloaded from Niobe or Ghost perspective. We see how Niobe finds Morpheus and how they end up in the big freeway fight with the agents and the twins. In the game, all of that is in the big driving sequence where you have to stall the agents and keep them from getting to Morpheus. This is all cut together with the ending of the freeway battle and Neo saving Morpheus and the Keymaker. The Logos crew then ends up teaming up with Morpheus and his crew. Niobe and Ghost end up blowing a nuclear power plant to remove power from the building so that Neo can finish his mission at the end of Reloaded.
All right. Scenes 13 through 16 are pretty inconsequential and don't offer much beyond what we already saw in Reloaded. And the only thing that happens in scene 17 is that Seraph contacts the Logos and says that the Oracle needs to speak with them immediately. In Niobe and Ghost's individual talks with the Oracle, we find out that the Merovingian warned the Oracle that if she chose to help Neo, that there would be consequences. At least one of those consequences was losing her former body. And we find out that this happened because the family of programs Neo meets in the train station with the daughter named Sati in Revolutions. It seems that they sold Oracle's termination code of her original form to the Merovingian to save their daughter Sati, who, according to the Oracle, will one day change both the machine world and the real world forever. The rest of the cutscenes are fairly irrelevant, and like those others, so I think that basically covers the Matrix discussion.
Mostly, though there are a few last noteworthy things to mention. The last sequence after the power plant level involves some pretty major characters. Not only do we get to the Oracle, but if you play the game right, you'll also run into Agent Smith. So let's set up the context of the Oracle scene. After Seraph contacts the Logos, Niobe and Ghost go to see the Oracle, but they have to fight Seraph first like Neo did. If you win, the Oracle has a moment with either Niobe or Ghost, and both encounters are revealing, depending on which character you play as. If you don't, you're not allowed to see the Oracle. Your character complains about missing something, and then you get the end sequence with the machines chasing the Logos. But if you beat Seraph, you get to meet the Oracle, and it's worth it. Once again, Ghost is really interesting in his scene with the Oracle. Apparently, the Oracle had told him that Trinity would never love him, and he found it freeing to be rid of the expectation or hope that she might. It's a bit Buddhist in a sense, with the idea that desire is what chains him. By being free of that expectation, he can focus on his mission and his calling, which is winning the war and helping the One. He's almost like a warrior monk, and I find that really interesting.
Nice observation. I think that is exactly what they were going for. Ghost is becoming more awesome all the time, thanks to that game, really.
Oh, he definitely is. On the way back to the ship, Niobe and or Ghost have a encounter with Agent Smith in the programmer's corridor. Niobe and Ghost then have to make a run for it in a fast-paced escape scene. You cannot fight Smith, and if you try to do it, you will die. All you can do is run along some construction sites and try not to get killed until you can reach the phone to escape. Now, after they get back to the ship, the Logos is discovered by the machines, and then they have to escape, leading to the beginning of Revolutions, which is why you find the ship broken down later on. Eventually, they get away after a couple of ship driving levels, and that's pretty much the game. Enter the Matrix cover pretty much the whole of Reloaded, in addition to some previous stuff, and then setting up where the Logos is in Revolutions. I'll also add that the Oracle scene is central to understanding certain things that happen in Matrix Revolutions. The scene explains why the actress is different in the third film. It also sets up why the family and Satya are so important in Revolutions, as you note, which is the problem that I had with watching that film in isolation. But honestly, I think the Enter the Matrix is required viewing. Even if you only see the extra film footage on YouTube, that's still a lot of important information that gives context to Reloaded. I think my biggest problem with the sequels for the longest time is that there was a lot that didn't seem to make sense. I didn't know all that information was in the game. Going through the gameplay and the extra footage was enlightening and puts the sequels in a different context for me.
Honestly, I'm really happy to hear that. I love these movies, and like you, I love them even more having watched the Animatrix and having gone through Enter the Matrix. But that about wraps up our time for this first part of our Matrix franchise discussion. We'll pick up right with our discussion on about Revolutions and the Matrix Online and Resurrections when we see you tomorrow. Thanks for hanging out with us, and feel free to reach out to us on Twitter at Omen Revelations with any questions and comments about the episode. We'd love to hear from you.